Hello everyone, it's your boy Jeff here again with you. This video is going to be a dual retro review of two Stephen King books. That's kind of become a dual side purpose for this channel besides music and records. And if you saw my last video, you'll know why I really haven't had time to listen to much music. But that time has given me the opportunity to do a little bit more reading than I normally would. So I finished two Stephen King books. One is a novel, the other is a story collection. So let's get right to it. The first one being Firestarter. This was the first book of King's that I bought and tried to read but never finished. I mentioned this in an earlier video. Reading it through now for the first time as an adult, because when I first bought this, I was probably in 6th or 7th grade. And this book didn't really have the kind of story that I was looking for from King at that time, which was, the horror, mostly the straight horror stories, that he'd been writing that I adored. And this novel is more of a suspense novel with paranormal elements added, primarily that being the pyrokinetic powers that Charlie McGee has, who's the main character. She's a 10-year-old girl. And her father also had powers too, to kind of influence people. He called it pushing them. But beyond that, there's really no horror type of things in this book. Understanding that now as an adult, and reading it through, it's a fine book. I don't think this is rated all that highly among King novels. I don't really know why. It's certainly well written. It does drag a little bit in the middle, but that's just because he's setting up the situation for the final showdown, which is coming. And it's trying to put this in context with the books that he'd written up to this point. This is kind of the beginning of the longer setup for the final showdown, if you will, or resolution of the book, and that resolution being pretty fast. And that's what happens here. Not necessarily a bad thing. It's not as bad as it would get in future novels of his, but I'll just show you the back here. This was the book club edition of the hardcover. This isn't an original printing, but for a lot of these early King books that I'm backfilling as hardcovers in my collection, I don't have all that many of them as first editions, but that's okay, just as long as they're hardcover. But anyway, this came out in 1980, and I'm actually kind of surprised that King never went back to Charlie and did a sort of a sequel, or at least told us what happened to her after the end of this book. Because he did it with Danny Torrance. He wrote Dr. Sleep, which was the sequel to The Shining. He did it with Jack Sawyer, with Black House, which was the sequel to The Talisman. And there's supposed to be a third book in that series or trilogy that King and Peter Straub are supposed to write that I've heard about, but who knows when it'll ever appear, if it'll ever appear. But I'm really surprised King never went back to Charlie, because I think seeing her as an adult with her pyrokinesis abilities would be interesting. And I'm just a little surprised he never went back to revisit it. Maybe he didn't really care for her after he was done with the book. I don't know. But I didn't hate this book. I was, more curious about it, to coming back to it again as an adult from trying to read it as a kid. Under those terms, I enjoyed this book. It kept my interest. It kept me turning the pages. And, the ending could have been a little bit better, but it wasn't completely unexpected. So for my money, Firestarter is a pretty decent novel of King's. certainly not as hateable as I've seen people do it on the social medias, as we call them. So I enjoyed this one. This was a good one. Then a book that I just finished reading this morning, and this is also from early in his career, is the short story collection called Night Shift. Now this it's a pretty short book. It was only like 330 some pages, but it's got 20 stories in here. So that's there's a lot of material to cover. And there's a lot of classic King stories in here. For example, in terms of the book Salem's Lot, this collection leads off with a story called Jerusalem's Lot, which is sort of a prequel to Salem's Lot. It's talks about, you know, the town of Jerusalem's Lot, like in the 1800s. I think it was the 1850s. And it's a very Lovecraftian type of story. And if you read it, you'll know why, if you're familiar at all with H.P. Lovecraft. Very enjoyable. Also, another story that was a sequel to Salem's Lot. It's the second to the last story in this book, which I reread just this morning, like I said. It's called One for the Road, and it takes place 2 years after the events in the Salem's Lot novel. And that's just as good as the book. And I know you can get both of those stories. I think Fuego mentioned this on his channel. You can get both of those stories included with the Salem's Lot novel in the remastered edition. I can't remember. Is it the Cemetery Dance edition? I don't know. But those stories are also collected here. This is just the back cover. Some other famous stories. Children of the Corn. Of course, that was made into a movie with several sequels. I saw the first one. I never saw any of the sequels, but the story itself was still pretty good. The Ledge, which I think was made into a segment of the Creepshow. Was it in Creepshow 2? I want to say. Trucks, of course, became the movie Maximum Overdrive, which King himself directed. There's also not so much a prequel to The Stand. It's a story called Night Surf. It's kind of like a early version of what King would further expand on with his novel The Stand. You know, it mentions the Captain Trips virus. The Mangler, which is one of my favorite stories. It's about a demon-possessed steam iron machine that is very... it would fit right in with like the Creepshow theme, you know, that kind of EC Comics 50s horror vibe, you know, updated to like the 70s when he wrote it. Gray Matter, which I know was just recently made into a segment of the TV series of Creepshow, which I haven't seen, and I don't have that channel, but I would love to. And a lot of the other stories that, you know, in here are, some are just straight up horror, some are more suspense. You know, not every single story is gory and bloody. But I think from, I have to mention The Lawnmower Man. That's got to be still the most effed up story in this book for me. And it's real short. It's only like 10 pages long, but it's effed up. And if you guys have read it, you know what I'm talking about. So, for my money, this is King's best story collection. I like a lot of his other collections too. There's always some gems in there, but this one, front to back, almost every story is a winner for me. So, and here comes my dog Jinx, of course. So yeah, Night Shift. This is a book that I reread. You know, it's been probably 30 years since I've actually read the whole thing front to back. So this was part of my project. Firestarter was one that I hadn't read before or hadn't finished. And this one is one that I remember lovingly. So if you've never read any King and you want some, there goes Jinx again, and if you want some short tastes of his style, this would be a good place to start. Night Shift. So, going back to the theme of reading King that I've never read before, which is coming up next, I'm actually going to be reading, this is the brand new collection by his son Joe Hill that just came out. I just got it last week. It is a signed copy. I was not able to go to any book signings because there was none around me. I think the closest one was in Milwaukee, but there was no way that I could get away. So I just ended up ordering a signed copy. But there are 2 stories in this book that were co-written with Stephen King. So I'm kind of cheating and counting this as more King reading, even though it's going to be mostly Joe Hill stories. But In the Tall Grass is collected here. That was one of the stories that they co-wrote together. And I just saw the movie version of it on Netflix. So I want to read the story just to compare, the story to the movie while the movie's still kind of fresh in my mind. So that was one of the main reasons why I went to this. Plus, here's just the back cover. Here's a picture. In case you guys don't know what Joe Hill looks like, there he is. There was a great video that I just watched last week of a book signing that he and his dad did. And they basically interviewed each other for like an hour. And it was pretty interesting. I'll see if I can find the link to put that in the description below. But this is going to be what I'm reading next. And yeah, I know it's not all Stephen King, but there's a couple stories co-written by him in here. So that's why I'm counting. That's why I'm counting it. And that's what I'm going to be reading next. And on a further note about Joe Hill, I ended up picking up all of his books in hardcover too. There aren't as many as there is for his dad, so it was a little bit easier. They all haven't arrived yet. I still have 2 more coming in the mail. So you'll probably see Joe Hill books sprinkled probably in between the King books as I go along and as I decide what to read next. So I enjoy his style pretty well too. Like I said, I've read a couple of his already, and it's very reminiscent of his dad's style of writing. Both good and bad. But overall, from what I've read, I've enjoyed. So I'm kind of anxious to dive further into his catalog too. And of course, we're closing in on Halloween. We're about a week out from Halloween. So I also picked a story collection instead of a big long novel, so I can hopefully get some shorter spooky thrills in before Halloween comes and goes like it does very quickly. So yeah, that's where I'm at with my King reading project. Firestarter and Night Shift, both enjoyable books, both early career King books. Night Shift came out in 1978 and Firestarter came out in 1980. So now we're going to jump to the present day here with his son for a little bit. And from there, who knows? So that's just my little retro reviews of a couple of King books. Thank you all for watching. It's your boy Jeff. Peace. And I'll see you again soon. Take care.